All right, now we're going to talk about variable forms. Now, this lecture is going to be kind of hard to wrap your head around, so don't expect to understand it all right away. I promise it will click eventually, but if you do skip this because it's boring or just hard to understand, you're going to be finding yourself banging your head against the wall because this part of the lecture is really important, and it's something that I didn't come to understand until a couple years down the road. And spent a lot of time trying different pieces of code, trial and error. There were no tutorials when I was going through it. I wasted a lot of time, basically. So you want to pay attention to this. Just get through it with me. It's tough for me to explain this. It's going to be tough for you to understand. But I promise it will click as long as you get this in your head and you understand that these are there. This is a thing, and you can go and learn more about it as you learn. So every type that we talked about has a form, and there's currently 5 forms that you need to know about. There's a literal, const, input, simple, and series. So you don't see these when you're coding, but you can see them in the reference manual. So here we have const color, and color is the type, const is the form. Here's another reference for the close, and that's a series, but it's also type float. And another example to show you here is bar index. It's also a built-in variable. The type is series integer, where the series is the form. So the literal form literally represents a fixed value. This one is pretty straightforward. Here we have 3.14, that's a literal float. 42, it's a literal integer, and so on. Literal bool, literal string, literal color. And here I put in the little plot function where we have this built-in variable close with the title parameter equals a literal title. Moving on to const form. This form does not change during script execution. It's known or can be calculated at compile time. And it's typically referred to as a constant because this form remains constant throughout the whole execution of the script. You have constant int, constant float, constant string, constant bool, constant color. As an example, here we have this literal int, which is being assigned to a identifier, and on the back end, this identifier is going to be called a constant int. Because if this was the whole script, say that at the bottom here we had a plot function and the version at the top, C1 remains the same throughout this whole script, so it's constant. It does not change. And here you can actually see we're using a constant int plus a literal int, and it equals C2, which is just another identifier. And C2 actually remains constant. We don't see it anywhere else in this script being modified or changed. It remains constant. Same thing here. We have constant int. Again, we can use the same constants. It's not changing. Plus this literal int. It's being assigned to C3. C3 is now a constant int, but down here, here's this little if statement. If the open is greater than the close, this is probably going to happen somewhere in the script as it's executing, and C3 will be reassigned, as we have it here, to this literal int. And because we're reassigning it, it changes into a series form. Now, a series form is the most common form in Pine. You're going to be working with this one the most. You're going to see it the most. This one changes during the script execution, as we just saw. You can store a sequence of historical values that are associated with the bars of the main chart, and those values can be accessed using the bracket operator. You can't overwrite the historical values. You can only write to the most recent bar. Basically, open, high, low, close. We've seen these built-in variables. Those are series forms, and there's many more. You can make your own series forms, as you saw in the constant example, where every time you reassign a variable with the walrus operator, it changes, and therefore it becomes a series. Also, any expression that contains a series variable will be treated as a series itself. We have series int, series float, series string, bool, color, label, line, NA, and there's no such thing as series plots right now, or H-lines. And here's an example of a series form and how they kind of work. So here we have the series float and another series float. These are the built-in variables. We're just adding them together. This A identifier will actually end up being a series float itself. Will just be the open and the close added together, the sum of that. Here on line 38, we have series high, which is all the highs in the entire chart. But this one right here is the most current high, plus 2,000. And this plus 2,000 goes across the whole chart. And this is a literal int, but because this is a series and we're adding them both together, the series takes priority here, and this identifier here will be a series form. And here we're showing you how to use the bracket operator, and we're actually referencing yesterday's close. So it's zero-based indexing, and 0 would be the most recent, the current bar that we're on. 1 is yesterday. And C is actually a series form as well. And you can see here, if you hover over the close, it shows you built-in variable and the type series float. So all the open, close, high, low, those are all series floats. The next form is the input form. The input form does not change during script execution. It's unknown at compile time, and basically all you really need to know is that it originates from an input function. We have input floats, input ints, input strings, input bools, and here's some examples. Basically, whenever you use this function, the input, and you assign it to a variable, you get an input form. We haven't really worked with inputs too much, but it's basically when you want to use user-defined variables on the front end. So here's the front end. If you were to go to settings of an indicator, you'll find a bunch of inputs, and these are the inputs we just made in the example. Input integer, and that should be pretty straightforward. Here's the input bool, check, and that's how you change your settings with inputs. The last form is the simple form, and this one does not change during script execution. It's unknown at compile time. These are values that come from the main chart symbol. So these come as simple floats, simple ints, simple strings, simple bools, and simple color. And simple is usually omitted. So when you're looking at the reference documents, you'll see actually the type is just float. It doesn't say simple float or simple int or simple string. You won't see that in most cases. You'll just see the name of the type, which is just float in this case. We're accessing the docs for siminfo.mintick for that built-in variable. So basically, in most cases, you won't need to worry about what form your variable is. Just remember that forms are just different varieties of the types. Kind of like water has 3 different forms: ice, liquid, and gas. Simple, literal, and input and const forms are pretty much all almost identical. Mostly just pay attention to if it's a series or not, and let the automatic casting system and the back end take care of the rest. If you screw something up, there will be an error, and it will tell you and let you know that your form does not work.